everyone. Sorry it's been a while. I had some family stuff and then I had a little accident that hurt my right shoulder, so typing or using my mouse has been off limits. While I was recovering, I started rewatching the trial from the beginning, and I realized that I had forgotten so many things. When I first started watching, I didn't realize how big it was going to get, or how deep I was going to get into the whole story. So, rewatching it with fresh eyes has really changed what I see. I know a lot of you have told me that you're really waiting on part 2 of the reenactment of the murders, and I really want to get to that, which is why I was rewatching. But rather than have to wait till I get through it all, I thought, why not share the points that I'm finding with you all as I go? It's a 6-week trial, so I won't go day for day. This video will cover some background on Dick Harpootlian and his opening statements on day 1 of the murder trial, and my notes as I rewatched it with fresh eyes, knowing everything that we know now. So, whether you watched every moment as it happened and would like reminders, or just to see it again after knowing all the details, because when we first started the trial, we didn't know all of the details. So going back knowing everything we know now is really a different watch. Or maybe you came upon this story much later and you still need to catch up with the details. Whatever the case, come with me and let's review day 1 of the double murder trial where Alex Murdaugh is charged with killing his wife and son outside the kennels of their home on Moselle in Islandton, South Carolina on June 7th, 2021. I'm also going to share 2 interviews from Dick Harpootlian and let you hear his own words as the reason why I call him, and I've named this episode, the snake charmer who wants ugly jurors who have no life. Let's get started. This is Trial Discussions with Cassidy, Day 1 of the Murdaugh murder trial. Welcome. Another great reason to do this is because of the accusations made by Team Alex stemming from who we now know as the salty egg juror. We've now seen the proof that she spoke at the very least to her tenants about being a juror and voiced her opinions about Alex's guilt to them, and they in turn told others who told others. One of those others is the one who did her duty as a citizen of South Carolina and actually sent an email to Judge Newman telling him so. It was investigated, found to be true, and the juror was excused, famously asking for her dozen eggs before being sent out of the courtroom. We'll talk more about that when it actually comes up in the trial, but for now, I just want to point out how clearly the rules were given to the jury at the very start of the trial.
What I will say now is intended to serve as an introduction to this trial. These remarks are not a charge on the law. I will instruct you on the law in greater detail at the end of the trial before you retire to consider your verdict. But this is an explanation of the procedure that we will follow in this trial. Until I tell you that it's time to do so, you cannot discuss the case with anyone, including your fellow jurors. You cannot discuss the case with family, friends, or anyone else. The attorneys in the case, you cannot discuss it with them or any parties or anyone else that might be connected with the case. Should you discover that a fellow juror is violating that oath and that order, you are to bring that to my attention.
So, for these accusations to come up so far after the trial is suspicious. They had been given clear instructions, and the judge, every single time he dismissed them, even for short breaks, he would remind them without fail not to discuss the case. He's a kind, approachable man, and we see this by the way he dealt with the egg juror on 2 different occasions. There are transcripts from these meetings with her and the counselors. There was the Facebook situation, and then this tenant situation where he received the email, where he really showed how reasonable and approachable he is. So if they felt someone went beyond instruction, why didn't they say so at the time? I say it's because at the time, whilst immersed in all the evidence, they knew he was guilty, And perhaps now they've been approached by or badgered by other people with their own opinions. There are some who feel very strongly in Alex's innocence. They occasionally come here to my channel, some respectful, some outright rude and belligerent, to tell me and some of you commenting on my channel how wrong we are to believe he's guilty. I chalk some of it up to there are just people in this world who are easily fooled. Others just plain like to be contrary. Whichever way the flow is going, they want to swim against it, whether right or wrong. They just like to disagree and think it makes them smarter than everyone else. Sometimes the flow is wrong, but it's not always wrong. With all of my heart, I believe this one is right. I believe he was appropriately found guilty. And there I've gone again. Off topic. Back to the trial. Creighton gave his opening statement outlining the gathering storm that led to the murders that the state's case planned to show.
The evidence is going to be such that you're going to reach the inescapable conclusion that Alec murdered Maggie and Paul, that he was the storm, that the storm was coming for them, and the storm arrived on June 7th, 2021, just like the storms that are heading here right now, that they died as a result, beyond any reasonable doubt. Thank you.
My clips are mostly going to be short, so I'm not really showing anything else of Creighton's opening statements. It's all stuff that he lays out during the whole trial. However, I'm going to show you a lot more of Dick's because it's just so... I don't even know which adjective to use. Yucky? See for yourself.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my name is Dick Harpootlian. It is our honor to represent Alec Murdaugh.
It's their honor to represent Alex Murdaugh? Their honor? Let's talk about Dick for a minute. Dick is a state senator for South Carolina. This is his campaign. Here he is asking for contributions for his campaign to run for state senator. He says, "I'm putting government to work for you." Going on, "I ran for the state senate because I believed the status quo wasn't working for everyday people. Since taking office, I have worked hard to get government working for you and eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse that hurts our schools and roads." Let that sink in for a minute. This is what he's running his campaign on. Getting rid of fraud, waste, and abuse? Who in the whole history of the state of South Carolina has committed more fraud than Alex Murdaugh? We're talking 9 million. That's the number that the federal court came up with. $9 million. And who did Alex steal from? Did Alex steal from rich people? Alex stole from these everyday people that Dick is saying that he's working so hard for, eliminating fraud and abuse. Yet there he stands defending and saying it's his honor to defend a man who has hurt South Carolina more than anyone else in the modern history of the state. That's Dick, ladies and gentlemen. It's offensive. It shows he follows money and glory, getting his name out there, not the people's best interest, as he claims. What about his so-called courtroom prowess? In interviews, he proudly boasts about the secrets of his success, but I don't think his methods work in modern times. In his days, there weren't scammers everywhere, online, in text messages, emails, phone calls, websites, that made people aware of the need to protect themselves. An awareness that deception is literally everywhere. But nowadays, information is at everyone's fingertips. Because of this exposure to scammers and liars, cynicism is at an all-time high. Along with paranoia, people are not so easily tricked today. Conspiracies are everywhere. Revolt and rebellion are everywhere. They are natural reactions to people being aware that scammers and liars are everywhere. People are not so easily intimidated by someone's name or position anymore. People don't automatically respect authority. Look at the things that have happened at the Capitol. Look at the things that have happened to police. It's a different world. Respect has to be earned. Once you've been caught lying, you're a liar. Dick has not kept up with the times, but he relies on old tricks from a time gone by. He's so sore that he lost this case that he was so sure he'd win. He almost can't believe it and definitely can't accept it. But this case was tried in front of the whole world, not just in front of people who knew his reputation or might be a little awed at his court presence. He tried it in front of people like me, who've never heard of him. This was our first impression of him, and it was not a good impression. In court, he looked like a sleepy pug dog, or mostly like a cranky Mr. Magoo. He comes across as slimy, untrustworthy, and lacking in morals. When he pointed a gun at opposing counsel in court during a murder trial, where he himself had given the most gruesome descriptions of the wounds Maggie and Paul suffered at his client's hands, and thought it was funny, that was just one example of how out of touch and inappropriate he is. When all of social media turned on him for it, he didn't even know what to think. He called it vitriol. No, it was a reaction to something in such poor taste that most of us couldn't even believe our eyes when we saw him doing it, with a big grin on his face like he was so cute. It's time for him to pack it up and go live with his wife in her ambassadorship in Slovenia, where she can mind him. Okay, reel it back in, Cassidy. What do I mean about his secrets to success? I want to share 2 interviews he's done and what was said. For the first one, it was a podcast called May the Record Reflect. It was published on November 2nd, 2021 by the National Institute for Trial Advocacy, episode 24. Let's listen.
It's not just about your client, it's how does the jury react to you? And so your persona, your relationship with them. I mean, one of the things in South Carolina, you can what I call work the jury rail. It's very important. I mean, you need to adopt a persona for the case that you believe the jury will appreciate. By the way, when they're looking at the back of the seat in front of them, they're not looking at you. They're not looking at you. So I use, and I still use, big pieces of poster board. This sounds like the Stone Age, I'm sure, to your folks out there. Now, you do a poster board with, the key quotes from the key documents, and you walk back and forth in front of the jury rail, pointing it out, and they're looking at you and they're looking at the poster board. I mean, my persona in front of that jury was sort of I'm more like you than him. They're from Greenville. I went to Clemson. They're much more conservative than they would be perhaps down in Charleston, but they're common sense people, and they're going to read me and the other guy, and then they're going to listen. I mean, and that's the context for what they hear. You've got to work the jury. Secondly, what do you look like? How do you react? Do you get eye contact?
The idea that he relies on tricks, kinship, and charisma he thinks he has, rather than honesty and evidence, is so disrespectful and insulting to the jury, in my opinion. He's speaking like it's easy to fool them with his tricks, like some kind of snake charmer, to keep them from seeing evidence. If I were jurors hearing this, I would be insulted. But it gets worse. Let's look at the second interview. This was from a site called Whistleblower Laws. The article's name was Profiles in Justice, a one-of-a-kind trial lawyer, written by Reuben Gutman. The introduction: an unattractive jury, and a stirring tale of conflict, emotion, sex, and violence are some of the essential ingredients for success in a trial, according to seasoned U.S. trial lawyer Dick Harpootlian. He shares some tips with Reuben Gutman. Let's have a look at those tips. And I want you to notice how not one of the 5 tips he gives have anything to do with legal skill or evidence. Tip number 1, pick a jury not based only on your client's profile, but also yours. If the jury hates you, they usually won't like your client. This has caused me to gravitate towards unattractive people on juries. They don't feel threatened by me. and aren't disdainful like attractive people. So, do you hear that, jurors? If Dick picked you, he picked you because he thinks you're ugly. If you're attractive, he doesn't want you. Don't even try. Because if you're attractive, you might feel threatened by him, and you might be disdainful. But if you're ugly, hey, you're the juror for Dick. Tip number 2. Never suffer a misstatement of the facts by opposing counsel in opening statement. Since his or her back is toward you during this process, I call it the kidney punch objection. Most attorneys have a difficult time recovering from the objection, especially if it happens more than once. If they have prepared an opening, they never seem to get back to it. Don't let them frame the case based on lies. Now, on the surface, this one doesn't sound quite so bad because he is talking about protecting the case from lies. But, as we'll see in his opening statements, what he considers a misstatement is simply what doesn't fit his narrative. He doesn't care about lies or truths. He gets things wrong himself in his opening statements, as we're about to see. So basically, this is a kidney punch trick to unnerve his opponent and mess up his opening statements if he doesn't like what's being said. Tip 3. Prior to trial, I almost always only depose experts to get their opinion and the materials they use to formulate the opinion. In most of my cases, expert depositions take less than 5 minutes. Why educate them before trial? Save the good stuff for the jury. 5 minutes for the expert deposition? It's not about educating them, they're the experts. It's about educating yourself so that you know how to try a case effectively. This is just lazy. To me, it shows he's not concerned about educating himself, trying to see the whole picture, or being bothered by facts as a lawyer should be. But when your tactics are tricks and choosing ugly jurors, what are facts really? They're not important. All you need is your tricks. Tip number 4. Own the courtroom. One of my frequent opponents when I was the DA paid me the most eloquent compliment. She said, Harpootlian is like a dog marking his territory in the courtroom, every corner, and invades your space as frequently as he can. It makes the opposing attorney anxious. Anxiety is your friend. What? Now we'll see him do this throughout the trial. He will crawl up on Creighton's back or whoever opposing counsel is at the time. Anytime they try to show something on the Elmo or on a poster board or act something out, he jumps up from his seat and gets over there and gets in the way. You'll also see him get so close to the jury that they can feel the spit in his breath. I toured that courthouse. The jury area is very cramped. They cut the jury out while they're filming for their anonymity, but when you see the actual room and see where he was standing with his hand on the half wall in front of the jury, you realize he was just about in their laps. Again, this has nothing to do with evidence or facts. This is simply tricks. Tip number 5, throw away the script. There is nothing more boring nor unproductive than to follow a script, checking off the points you want to make to prove the elements of your case. This is why we constantly hear him start a sentence, stop, start a new one, stop, start a new one, so that in 2 minutes of speech, he hasn't completed one thought.
What was it in that hour between when he's yucking it up with Paul? And let me say this to you. His record, he was interviewed, he comes home and finds, there's no question about this, they've got telemetry from his car.
This is the way you think when you don't care about facts or evidence or truth and you rely on tricks. A good juror wants all the facts. They want everything marked off. Now, for what he thinks jurors want. The jury wants a narrative, a story. An entertaining yarn full of conflict, emotion, sex, violence, yelling, weeping, etc. You get the idea. That means you have to have a general idea of what you want, but let the examination flow naturally. Set the witness up to confirm fact A and fact C, then box them into B. The jury will understand where you are going. Again, insulting. He thinks the jury wants to be entertained, not educated. They want some yarn with emotion, sex, violence, weeping. They're not smart enough to figure it out. They're just automatically gonna vote his way because he entertains them. He doesn't care about facts. He's all about tricks. And they call Nixon Tricky Dick? Here's the real Tricky Dick, right here. But worst of all, let's read the last two sentences. Remember, these are unattractive people who watch a lot of TV and read most of their evenings. They have lots of imagination. Did you catch that? These are unattractive people. And I'm assuming that because they're unattractive, he thinks they have nothing going on in their lives. I mean, they're too ugly to go out or have friends or have dates. So because they're unattractive, they watch a lot of TV and they read most of their evenings. I mean, where are ugly people going to go? What's an ugly person going to do in the evening? So because they have no lives, they have lots of imagination. Sick. I was absolutely disgusted when I read that. Did you hear that, jurors? He wants ugly jurors who have no lives besides TV and reading so he can play his tricks on you. I truly hope the jurors on these so-called dirt roads that he visited and led to make statements against the courthouse staff hear these words. He thinks you are easy prey because you're too ugly to have a life and too simple to hear facts and just want to be entertained. Absolutely disgusting. This is your legendary attorney. This is your state senator and what he thinks of you and why he chose you. Now keep all of this in mind as we go through this trial, please. I promise you will see him in a different light. Now, back to Dick's opening statements.
Now stand up. This is Alec Murdaugh. And Alec was the loving father of Paul and the loving husband of Maggie.
Trick number 1. Have Alex stand up, face the jury, look them in the eye. Because of who he was in that area, it's a bit of intimidation as well. They can see Alex sitting there. They don't need him to stand up, but this gives Alex a chance to lock eyes with them. A lot of jurors only look at the accused when he or she is looking at the person who's testifying, or other moments when he's not looking at them. Then they can study his movements. And when he or she does look in their direction, they often avert their eyes. This is a trick to try to establish a connection. It's not the worst thing we could see happening, but just pointing out his methods.
He swatted them. When I say he swatted them, when they were swatted, and no question.
I just thought this was funny because swatting is a term used. It's something that gamers have been doing to each other, where they call in a bomb threat or some kind of terror threat to the emergency systems to try to get a SWAT team to come and terrify their opponent. I've seen this on some recent documentaries. One guy was even killed over it by the SWAT team. It's a serious problem these days, but it's an action that's carried out by law enforcement, not by civilians. And especially not by one person. It refers to a big team of law enforcement, usually a SWAT team.
Paul Murdaugh was shot twice with buckshot, 12-gauge buckshot, once in the chest. And by the way, that shot would indicate it was in the chest and came out under his arm, like somebody that might have been holding up their hands. So when he says no defensive wounds, he perhaps was being held at shotgun. I mean, I can make the same sort of speculation that the Attorney General can, because that's all he's doing is speculating. What we do know is 12-gauge, fairly close range shot to the chest. He must have been turned because it comes out under his arm. There's wadding, if you're familiar with a shotgun, under his arm.
This is one of those instances that I was talking about, where during his opening statements, he makes clear factual errors. I don't know if it's intentional or if this is one of those cases where he didn't listen to the expert witness during deposition. Yes, Paul was shot from a side angle. He did not have his arms raised. But here's Dick putting it to the jury right at the beginning of trial as fact, when it's not. Now from here, I want to issue a trigger warning, because Dick tries to find the most theatrical, gruesome details he can to describe the murder scene. No other lawyer on either side is so graphic. He does not spare anyone. Buster's in that audience, but his theatrics are more important than thinking of how these words might affect people. Why? Because in his reasoning, a father and husband couldn't commit such gruesome acts. Let's forget the fact that every day 3 women are killed by their partner or ex-partner. Every day in this country. Worldwide, the numbers are higher, but every day this happens. Do you know what else happens every day in this country? A child is killed by its parent. What do the facts show? When the child is grown or half grown, is the preferred method of doing so? Guns. He's trying to take advantage of people's decency because most of us are incapable of doing this to someone in our family, let alone a son. But the fact is, there are over 500 a year parents who kill their children. That averages out to more than once a day. It was Alex's day that day. It happens. The gruesomeness of the murder, it's not like that was planned. His first shot to Paul was he did a quick step into the shed, fired on Paul, stepped out. He didn't expect to have to see it. He thought he could just bam, done. It got gruesome because it didn't kill Paul, and he staggered out of that shed, and he had to shoot him again. It's not like he stood there thinking, oh, if I shoot him right now like this, his brains are going to be everywhere. I can't do that. I'm his father. It's just how the murder played out. A person can plan a murder for a long time, but when they're actually doing it, there are feelings that cause things to go wrong. When actually faced with it, it's a whole different ballgame. Now, as far as Maggie, I'm sure he thought he could turn that rifle on her and take her out in one quick shot. But he was unnerved. He was unnerved by Paul poking his head out of that shed unexpectedly. He had to do a second shot. You know, by the time there's a second shot fired, Maggie is seeing what's going on. Who knows what she might be saying or doing. I made a video of what I think was happening. But she was facing him, and what appears to be on the approach in his direction, at least at first. This was not going the way he planned it. I'm sure he never expected to fire off 5 shots to take Maggie down. And the last shot, probably because he'd been unnerved by thinking that Paul was dead, and Paul turned out to not be dead. So he had to take another shot. Well, I'm sure that's heavy on his mind. So that when Maggie was in fact down, he was scared she might still be alive just like Paul was, and then gave her that final shot. That crime scene was messy. Why was it messy? Because it didn't go the way he planned. We'll see later when those first responders are there, all he's worried about is, are they dead? Is it official that they're dead? Did somebody check them? Are they dead? He wanted confirmation that they were dead. So describing the gruesomeness of the crime scene does not give us any proof whatsoever that it wasn't Alex who did it. In fact, the way the murders were committed, so messy like that, shows a lot of emotion and a person struggling with committing this murder. These were hired cartel or all these other things that people are coming up with, they would have stood back, one on Maggie, one to Paul. They would have taken their time, got a kill shot, got it done. This was frantic, messy, emotional. So describing every graphic, gruesome detail, it's just serving as horrifying anyone who hears it. It just makes us look at Alex as a bigger monster than we began with. But again, courtroom tricks. Oh, it can't be. He's trying to appeal to people's decency. We couldn't see ourselves doing something like that. So he's trying to say there's no way Alex could do something like that. When in fact, every day, 3 men kill their wives or partners or ex-partners. And over 1 parent kills their child in this country every day. It's not a good argument. And let's not forget, Alex is not a decent person. Look at his financial victims. Who did he target? Alex is not a decent person. This argument doesn't work.
The second shot ended up, and there's going to be some question about the direction of that shot, but ended up entering his skull cavity, and the gases from that shot literally exploded his head like a watermelon hit with a sledgehammer. All that was left was the front of his face. Everything else was gone. His brain exploded out of his head, hit the ceiling in the shed, and dropped to his feet. Horrendous, horrible, butchering. So, to find Alec Murdaugh guilty of murdering his son, you're going to have to accept that within an hour of having a extraordinarily bonding, you can see it in the Snapchat, that he executes him in a brutal fashion. Not believable. Not believable. Now, Maggie is shot running. There's no defensive wounds because she's shot running, and after she falls to the ground and has one bullet that has hit her and probably traveled up and hit her brain, she's on the ground, and whoever the perpetrator was walked up, took that AR, and put one in the back of her head. Executed. Executed.
So, as I mentioned, the average number of kids killed by their parents every year is around 500. This was an article written by Doug Chris of CNN. It starts off by saying it's the most unfathomable of crimes, a parent killing their own child. It grabs headlines when it happens. So yes, it's shocking. Yes, it's hard to imagine. Yes, most people couldn't do it. However, 500 children on average are killed by their parents every year. That's at least one a day, some days two, some days more. But on average, over one per day. And these numbers come from a study that was 3 decades long, from 1976 to 2007, so 31 years. And this is the average. More statistics, you might think this happens more often in step families. That's only 10% of the victims. 90% of the victims were the killer's biological children. Sons are more likely to be killed than daughters. That's 52%. And how were they killed? Most often, they used what's been called personal weapons, like their hands, or something held in their hands, to beat, choke, or drown. That's usually underage kids. If the victims were adults, parents used guns in 72% of those killings. Is it something we want to pretend doesn't happen? Of course. Is it something that does happen? Sadly, yes. A person like Alex, who appears to have no empathy just by looking at the people that he victimized. Orphans, widows, widowers, people who lived in the poverty level, mothers who lost their child, deaf quadriplegics. This is a man who doesn't have empathy for others. Is it surprising that his child would end up one of the 500? More statistics. Fathers are more likely to be the killers. 57.4% are fathers. In 1969, psychiatrist Philip J. Resnick pioneered this research. He came up with 5 reasons to why parents commit filicide. These reasons are still used today. The first one being, number 1, altruism. The parent kills the child because he or she may perceive it to be in the child's best interest. So, for example, a few days before the murders, there was an attempt to resolve the boat case with mediation. It failed. That meant there was going to be a trial. That meant it was very likely that Paul was about to serve prison time. A look at Paul's record showed that he continued to get into trouble even after the boat crash. He was caught headed out on a boat with lots of alcohol, again, for a big, drunken boat party. He had not learned anything from Mallory's death. And that leads to point 3, which I feel could apply here. Unwanted child. I don't mean that Alex didn't love Paul. As much as someone with Alex's personality can love someone else, I think he did. But that doesn't mean that Paul wasn't a hindrance. Because of Paul, and because of this boat crash, Alex was about to be exposed. Now, someone like Alex would most likely not look at himself and say, oh, why did I do these things? But they would be angry at the person who exposed them. What happened the day of the murders in his office? He was approached by Jeannie Seckinger. Do you remember what she said? We'll get to that when she testifies. But she said when she entered his office, he gave her a dirty look that she was not used to seeing and said, "What now?" This was Alex realizing Jeannie was on to him. Instead of being upset at himself for what he'd done, he was mad at her for discovering it. This is Alex's personality, where you can't take blame for your own actions. You project it onto someone else. This was Alex. So in his mind, it's very likely that that morning when Jeannie approached him in his office, he said, "What now?" and she told him the what now. He realized, I'm in trouble here. She had already come to him with the Hirschberger case. That got brushed aside. Now she's coming with the Ferris case. In a few moments, Dick is going to bring up that Alex's father was dying, and in fact died 3 days later. Other than the sadness of losing his father, something very important was going to happen with that situation. Who had always bailed Alex out? His father. In fact, as we went through all of the financial crimes, we found that in the stolen monies, he often repaid loans to his father with that money. One of them being well over $300,000. So that tells us the relationship here. When Alex got himself into trouble, he would reach out to Daddy, and Daddy would loan him money. If Daddy's going to be out of the picture, there's no one left to borrow money from. Mommy's got dementia. Mommy hasn't had access to her money in who knows how long. So Alex sees he's in a bad situation here. They're on to him at the office. The boat crash trial is about to take place, and it's all Paul's fault. Exactly what the sentence says. Regards as a hindrance. If you take away Paul, guess what? You're not going to get sued. If you're not going to get sued, you're not going to have forensic accountants in your business. Maybe he can smooth things over with work, still hide what he's done, not get caught. But if things move forward with that boat crash, oh boy, it's all going to come out just like it did. You know what else? Maggie is probably not going to stand for that. That's humiliating. She's already humiliated. She already doesn't want to live with him at Moselle, spending her time at Edisto. Another humiliation. Oh, look at Alex. His wife left him. He couldn't let that happen. Now, this was all supposed to be in a separate video about what I think the motives were, because I think it was a little bit different than how it was presented in court. But I feel like it applies here, because Dick is here saying, this is impossible. This couldn't happen. This is unfathomable. These people were butchered. Why would Alex do that? Oh, he loved him. Oh, he was having a great day with them. I think British researchers actually do a better job with this topic. In this article, Why Do Men Kill Their Families? By Eloise Hendy, published on February 21st of this year, she says, we want to make ourselves believe that they just snapped. The truth is much more shocking. She interviewed criminologists and experts on domestic violence about why women and children are being murdered by their partners. Here are some of the things she found. This Professor Wilson that we're going to read throughout this article co-authored a study in 2013. Some of the things to note: when it came to male perpetrators, there was much more intensity of violence. Men used much more dramatic forms of family annihilation. There was definitely a performative nature of the violence they would use. He goes on to say, really, what we were dealing with is a performance of masculinity that was, as they would have seen it, traditional, and how all of their masculinity became invested in their relationship, and their children will become seen as simply other forms of possession. Then he notes that although it's always been appalling, it got even worse since COVID. That now it's to the point that he's encountering cases of decapitation and mutilation all the time. He says familicide is entwined with patriarchal misogyny. It has its roots not only in domestic violence, but in everyday gendered assumptions about women and men's roles in society, and especially a warped and dangerous vision of what strong, successful masculinity looks like. They take issue with the use of the word altruistic. They use 4 types. Instead of altruistic, they say anomic, and then add disappointed, self-righteous, and paranoid. So this use of anomic instead of altruistic means alienated, purposeless, or socially disoriented. We were saying that's not altruistic. This is absurd. We're buying into the explanation of the man. It wasn't altruism. These men often were holding down good jobs, professional jobs, like perhaps a lawyer. Of the 59 family annihilators considered, there was quite clearly a group of men who were being made redundant or bankrupt or financially were in all kinds of problems. Does that sound familiar? He was about to lose his job as a lawyer, his law license. He was going to be bankrupt. He notes, this is where the term anomic emerged from. They saw their family as an extension of their economic success. So by the same token, their family was therefore an extension of their economic failure. Mass murder was then seen as a way of avoiding the consequences of being made bankrupt or redundant. They simply saw their family as a possession that they could then destroy. By destroying their family, and in this case he's talking about fathers who also commit suicide, by taking their own life, it prevented a judgment on them taking place. Now in Alex's case, he very much wanted to stay alive. So we need to look into his reasoning a little better. And that takes us to the self-righteous. The self-righteous family annihilator blamed his spouse, everything that was happening in terms of the family, in terms of his life, his feelings about his life, everything became focused on, it's the woman's fault. Or in this case, since Paul was grown, his fault. The key thing to grasp, which many people misunderstand, is that these men were not just snapping. These men were planning this over a long period of time. Do you remember Alex saying that? Somebody planned this for a long time. And the execution of the plan had a performative element, but would often be very carefully constructed. We want to make ourselves believe that they just snapped, because it's somehow easier psychologically to accommodate in terms of our sense of what seems senseless. But he had to confront that it wasn't like that at all. It was very carefully planned. This applies to me, in my opinion. In Alex's case, he was setting that day up. He was making sure Maggie came home. Think about what he said to the first responders. Some of the things he wanted known right off was the boat case, but also, me and Paul drove around the property. He wanted everyone thinking everything was fine. His reaction to me at the crime scene, and that will come up on later days in the trial, was not like a person who comes home to finding their wife and son killed. The shock and the grief didn't seem to be there. All this extra commentary, very strange. No expressions of, if only I had stayed down there with them. If I'd only taken them with me. No, we're going to find this person at all cost. Whatever it takes, we're going to find their killers. None of these things. But all this extra speech about this, about that. Very strange. No, is there any way we can save them? Are they breathing? Are they dead? Did you check them? Did somebody check them? Is it official that they're dead? Very strange reactions. And much more in line with him having planned this. Professor Wilson goes on, there was reportedly lots of tension within the family, to the extent that the police had in the past been called. Was there tension in this family over that boat crash? Oh yeah. In this interview of the victim that was given just weeks before her murder, she tells the school, she said, my husband had to get a new job he wasn't expecting to. Was that going to happen with Alex? Where was he going to find another job as prestigious as working in the family law firm? This prominent family from 100 years, he was going to lose all that. Professor Wilson goes on, George Patterson, that was the man who killed his wife and family, would have been self-righteous about that. This is you. I'm blaming you. It's your fault. Dr. Neil Websdale, the author of Familicidal Hearts, The Emotional Styles of 211 Killers, says there's a spectrum where he refers to a couple of different types, but one of them being civil, reputable killers that on the outside world would seem quiet, subdued, respectable, upstanding citizens. These are not people who ran around looking crazy. Dick talks about in the video that Paul was taking that it didn't sound like Daddy was going to come to kill somebody. Of course not. If it started flying off the handle, you think Paul and Maggie would have just stood still for that? It was planned. It was executed. It got messy, but it was planned. Websdale goes on, these perpetrators killed because their lives were spinning out of control and they perceived they faced the threat of bankruptcy, destitution, familial dissolution, or some other calamity. What was Alex facing? Bankruptcy? Destitution? He would have lost all the properties he had? Familial dissolution? Do you think Maggie would have stuck around? Or some other calamity? Alex had so much to lose. He was the fourth generation of this prominent family, and he was going to bring humiliation to all of them, to that whole record, that whole dynasty. But just like these men listed here, he couldn't take the blame. He had to point the blame. And where did his blame fall? Maggie and Paul. As it says, Websdale concludes, for most perpetrators, shame stems in large part from their sense they have failed to live up to the dominant ideas about masculinity. He couldn't control his son. He couldn't control his wife. She wasn't even living with him. She was living in Edisto most of the time. His masculinity being stolen from him by these two people. It's their fault. Rather than unexplainable crime that sits totally outside our realm of comprehension, it seems familicide is intimately entwined with the broader crisis of patriarchal misogyny. It has its roots not only in domestic violence, but in everyday gendered assumptions about women and men's roles in society, and especially a warped and dangerous vision of what strong, successful masculinity looks like. One of the things I noticed in the Netflix Season 2 documentary, one of the most shocking things, those of us who have looked into the Murdaugh's history, we remember that at some point, Alex's mother, Elizabeth, has an obituary published in the newspaper that they have to later explain, oh, it was just a hoax, oh, somebody was messing. But the family knew the truth to that. Maggie told Morgan the truth of that situation. What was it? She wanted to leave Alex's father. She wanted a divorce. And it was Alex's father who published that obituary. Now, what does that tell you? You're not leaving me, woman, unless it's through death. He put her in her place real quick. She never left. Maggie told that story to Morgan. Now we have Ruth Davison, the CEO of Refuge, a place where women can go when they're being threatened or battered. She says these are not isolated incidents. We know domestic abuse is a gendered crime rooted in misogyny. Tragically, women are most at risk of homicide when they leave or attempt to leave their abusive partner. You are only as safe as your male partner allows you to be. So, is it shocking Alex killed his wife and son? Yes, that's always going to be shocking anytime a father kills his own child or a husband kills his wife. Is it as rare as we thought? No. Does Alex fit the description of the men who do this? Yes.
Remember, that day, his father, who is dying, is taken to the hospital because his father's not there. He's in the hospital. He dies 2 days later. His father dies 2 days later.
Another attempt to make people feel compassion for poor Alex. His dad was dying, then his dad died. These are just tricks. They have nothing to do with Alex having killed them. In fact, as I just pointed out, it's a possible motive. And where was Alex's mercy for people who lost loved ones? People who lost their mom in a tragic car crash that they witnessed. People who lost their children, like Sandra Taylor, Pamela Pinckney. People who lost their parents, like Blondell Gary's daughter. People who lost their spouse, Arthur Badger. When he saw their losses, he saw them as a means to steal from them. No pity, no mercy. And now Dick uses Alex's loss to try to invoke some kind of pity from the jury.
And we also know that at 9:06, as he cranks his car, as the cell phone records show that, as the telemetry data shows the cell phone linking up with the car, that phone is being thrown on the side of the road almost a half a mile away. Now that is Houdini. That is magic. That is inexplicable.
Again, no such proof that Maggie's phone was being tossed at 9:06. What's more, this messes up his own timeline. He tried to state that Maggie's phone was in use by her as late as 8:54, making the murders a little bit later. But by doing that, he really messes up his own timeline. There's activity with Alex in his car at 9:03. Alex retrieved his phone at 9:02 and starts making a lot of frantic steps, placing him outside pretty quickly after that. So these murderers had 9 minutes to locate these guns, kill Maggie and Paul, clean up a bit, get back in their vehicle, and drive down the road and have that phone flying out of their window at 9:06, half a mile down the road. Talk about Houdini. Talk about magic. And Alex, who was outside, hears none of this. He doesn't hear a car pull up because he states under testimony that there was no one else out there when he was there. The dogs were not reacting. He's on a cart traveling up to the house. He doesn't hear a car approach. He doesn't hear shots. He doesn't hear a car start back up and drive out the driveway. He hears none of that even though he's outside from 9:03. Plus all the time he's on the cart riding up to the house. Those carts are really silent. They're not noisy like a car. You're not enclosed like a car. He was out in the open riding up to that house and heard nothing. And now by Dick saying the phone's being tossed by someone else at 9:06, that's really putting Alex outside during the time of the murders if they were committed by somebody else, which they weren't.
The night he comes home and finds his wife and son butchered. And when I say butchered, you're going to see these photographs. When I see them now, after having seen them for the last 4 or 5 months, it still shocks me. It still is tough to look at. It still bothers me. And he comes home and finds his son laying in his own blood with his brain laying at his feet, shot to hell. He walks over, he checks to see if there's any life there, although, he's seeing his brain laying outside his body. He knows there's nothing there. He goes over and tries to get a pulse out of Maggie. No pulse there. Calls 911.
This is a part of his story that makes absolutely no sense. According to the telemetry of the car, he had 19 seconds between putting his car in park and coming back to his car and calling 911. So we're supposed to believe he wasn't right up on their bodies. He parked, gets out of his Suburban, rushes to Paul, claims that he tries to take his pulse. Now, this is going to come up much more in day 2, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about it, but keep this in the back of your mind. He claims he got out of his car, ran to Paul, took his pulse, didn't feel one, ran to Maggie, took her pulse, then goes back to his car and makes these calls. And I saw a recreation where somebody showed it is physically possible to get out of the vehicle, run to one, run to the other, run back. But that's literally all they were doing. That's not what happens when you arrive on a scene and your loved ones are dead. You don't just turn into a robot and do this and do this and do this. There's a million things passing through your heads, a lot of emotions. The first inclination is disbelief. You're not expecting this. The last thing in the world you think you're going to see. There's disbelief and shock. you're going to grab those bodies. Even when you see something like how he describes Paul's brain being at his feet. Have you ever seen the footage of John F. Kennedy's assassination? A piece of his head goes flying back behind the car. And what does Jackie do? Even though bullets are flying, she dives on the back of that car to grab his brain. Because that's what happens. You're not making sense of the situation. You're always hopeful. You're always in disbelief. You always believe that everything's going to be okay. She thought she could grab that piece of his head, put it back on, and all would be well. That's the frame of mind you're in when you're in such a situation. People perform CPR on loved ones that they find that have been dead for a very long time, way beyond that sort of help. But their brains operate in such a way that there's disbelief. And again, keep in mind that he says he did this in day 2 when they talk about the positions of their bodies. But I put to you that it is impossible that even on someone where you can easily access where their pulse is, you have to try at least 15 seconds to register a pulse. And he supposedly did both, in addition to the time it took for him to get to his Suburban, to one body, then the other body, and then back to his Suburban, calling 911. Impossible.
They seized his clothes that night. Sled did. And they well, first of all, you're going to see in the videos from the officers that arrived that night, there's no blood on him. They didn't find any blood on him. Sled's testing indicated 12 different places on his shirt and pants. No human blood detected. Period. Okay? You'll see pictures. White t-shirt, no blood on it. Those are facts. Those aren't theories. Those are facts.
This comes up more in day 2, but again, if he went to them as bloody as they were, especially Paul, who had blood and water all around him, making the blood go even further, if he truly touched them, tried to take their pulses, there would be blood somewhere on him. He stayed clean for a reason. He knew he was about to try to get away with murder.
And I will tell you what happened that night. And this is a problem. He's questioned, and the questioning is pretty aggressive. You'll hear it. He's traumatized. They suspect him. They show up, he's got a shotgun. They suspect him. And the next morning, 2 people found butchered here in Colleton County, Moselle Road. The police announced, don't worry. There's no danger to y'all. There's nobody out there that could pose a danger to you. Because you see, they decided that night he did it.
This is also incorrect. We get to see clips in court of him being questioned. You can also go online and see the whole thing. No one was treating him aggressively. The questioning was not aggressive. Amongst themselves on their body cams, you hear them talking about the boat crash. They bought his story that night. He was not a suspect that night. And also, this release, he said the police issued a statement. There was a statement in a newspaper, but as you'll see in the next couple of days of testimony, the sheriff's office denies saying that to anyone.
Without forensics, without cell phones, without any of that. And they've been pounding that square peg in the round hole for the last, since June of 2021, resulting in charges in September of 22. And so, if he felt, and he did, and you'll hear it, the accusatory fashion he's being interviewed in, he may not have dealt all the facts.
And now he's making excuses for why Alex lied about having been at the kennels.
Whether he'd been down to the dog pens that night or not, really didn't matter. Really doesn't matter.
How does that not matter? Whether or not he was at the scene of the crime, and also him lying about having been there, it really doesn't matter?
The cell phone records would indicate he would have had less than 10 minutes to kill him, get up to the
Another
house.
false statement that gets
get in the car
proven
and
to be
crank it
false
up.
later.
And by the way, that audio they have of him and Maggie, they're talking about one of the dogs killing a chicken. And they were debating whether it was a guinea hen or a chicken. No animosity. Very normal discussion. Paul's very happy. And we know that Paul, after that, is texting back and forth with the girl about going to the movies. Nobody's down there threatening him. Daddy's not pulling out a shotgun and killing him. For, 10 minutes after that, he's texting this girl.
So someone about to commit a planned murder is going to somehow give it away by how they're acting? You don't think he wants them to feel safe and secure so he can carry out his surprise attack? This isn't a duel where they have equal opportunities. This is an ambush.
Big question. One shooter or two? Two guns, shotgun and an AR.
Which is exactly why he chose 2 guns, to give that impression. But if you look at the place where Paul was shot, and then you follow the casings leading up to Maggie, it's obvious whoever shot Paul continued on their path to Maggie. It wasn't 2 different shooters approaching from 2 different places. If they had snuck up that driveway, they would have separated, one heading to Maggie, one heading to Paul. They wouldn't have walked side by side holding hands, shot Paul, and then the other one take off towards Maggie. Marker number 13 was the first shot fired at Maggie. If someone were coming up the drive, it doesn't make sense that they would shoot straight ahead. The trajectory of that bullet is from where Alex stood, where he shot Paul. He turned his attention towards Maggie, who was in that direction, and that's why those bullet fragments were there at marker 13. And then they continue as he heads up to Maggie. Those shell casings are a direct path from where he shot Paul to where he shot Maggie. That makes no sense for 2 shooters.
And by the way, Maggie has no defensive wounds because she's running. What's she running from?
Maggie wasn't shot in the back. She wasn't running from a shooter. She was running to something. That's why all the entrance wounds are from the front. Until she's down, someone shoots her from the back, comes around with the same gun, and shoots her in the head. She wasn't being chased and shot at from the back.
And could you shoot? Typically she had a little shed right probably 150 feet from the feed room on the other side of a wall. Perhaps she heard the shotgun blast and came around and saw somebody or 2 people, and whoever it was opened up. Was there enough time to kill Paul and then find the AR and then ambush Maggie? Much more likely there were 2 people, but again, we don't have to prove anything.
Yeah.
Because you are protecting us from them, from the state, from the government.
What a thing to say. You're protecting us from the state. You know, the state that I'm a state senator in, but I need protected from. You are protecting us from the government.
These cell phone records he keeps talking about, I would say to you, are not necessarily accurate. I'll also tell you that there's going to be a bunch of people, and I will that have been promised something or threatened with something that may take the witness stand and say something. But I tell you what.
So phone records aren't accurate? Believe my lying client instead? Because phone records are not accurate? And who are these bunches of people who've been promised something or threatened by something, and that's why they're going to be in there testifying in this trial? What a thing to say. From the guy who's making more money off this trial than anyone else by far.
Remember, as you sit there right now, in your mind, he didn't do it. He is innocent. He would require a verdict of not guilty from you. That's the law. That's your oath. Thank you.
And that's the end of Day 1, Day 2 coming soon. Until then, this is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.